It stuttered, like a skipped beat, like the brief, terrifying sensation of falling, and then the desperate grab for something to hold on to. He saw me too. He didn't wave. He didn't come over. He just looked at me, and his eyes held mine for a full 3 seconds, an eternity in a room full of people, and then he turned back to his conversation like nothing had happened. I left early. I went back to the hotel. I lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to convince myself that I was going to stay there, that I was going to order room service and watch television and go to sleep like a normal person who had attended a reunion and was simply tired from the drive. At 10:30, there was a knock on my door. I opened it. He was wearing the same white shirt from that morning, but now the top button was undone and the sleeves were still rolled up and his hair was slightly disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it. He didn't say anything. He just walked past me into the room, sat on the edge of my bed the same way he'd sat in his own room that morning, and looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You left early," he said. "I was tired." "You're lying." I closed the door. I leaned against it. I looked at him, this man I'd been in love with for 15 years, this man who had never been mine and had never let me go, this man who knew what time my flight was and which floor I was on, and exactly which buttons to press to make me feel things I didn't want to feel. And I waited. "You blocked me," he said. "After the spring festival, you blocked me. You forced yourself on me, Daniel. I took what was between us," he said. "What had always been between us. Don't pretend you didn't want it." The words were exactly what I was afraid of hearing, because they contained just enough truth to be dangerous. He hadn't forced me, or rather, he had, but in the complicated way that force and want can become entangled when you're a woman who has spent 15 years wanting someone who treats you like an option instead of a priority. He had taken what he wanted because he knew, because he had always known that I would Luntus him. "Don't do that," I said. "Don't rewrite what happened." "I'm not rewriting anything." He stood up. He walked toward me. He stopped about a foot away from where I was standing, and he looked at me, and his eyes were dark and close, and I could smell his cologne and feel the heat of his body. "I'm just telling you the truth. You and I've been circling each other for 15 years, Catherine. You know it. I know it. Everyone who's ever seen us together for 5 minutes knows it. And I'm done circling." He kissed me then. And I want to be clear about what I mean when I say that. I mean that he kissed me, his hands on my face, his mouth on mine, his body pressing me back against the door I just closed, and I mean that I kissed him back. Not because I'd decided to, not because I'd planned it, but because this was the thing I'd been waiting for since I was 22 years old, and every year of waiting had just made the want more acute. We fell onto the bed together, the narrow, cheap hotel bed, with its beige coverlet, in the corner room of the Harlow, and we were 47 and 49 years old, and we had been doing this for so long that it felt like the only thing either of us knew how to do. Love quiet, forbidden midlife romance? Subscribe to Noah's Awakening for more slow burn stories. Number Part 3. The Force of It. Number. Chapter 8. I need to tell this part honestly, even though it shames me, because the shame is the point. The shame is the thing that tells me I haven't fully reckoned with it yet, and maybe I never will. It happened during the Spring Festival, February, the following year, 2020. I'd gone back to Riverside for a friend's birthday, a woman named Sandra from my graduate cohort who'd married into a wealthy family. Her husband was a partner at a law firm and who rented out half a restaurant for the occasion. The party was loud and full of people I didn't know. I'd had too much to drink, not enough to be incoherent, but enough to be unguarded, which is, in some ways, more dangerous. Daniel was there. Of course he was there. Our circles overlapped in Riverside, the way circles do when you're both from the same hometown network, and you both keep showing up in the same rooms, for reasons neither of you would admit to if asked directly. He'd RSVP'd late. He'd sat across the room from me all night. and I'd felt his eyes on me like a physical weight, like a hand on my shoulder, like a question I didn't want to answer. After dinner, a group of us went to a bar, one of those upscale cocktail lounges that Riverside had developed to attract the young professional crowd. All exposed brick and Edison bulbs and cocktails named after old movies. Sandra's husband knew the owner. We'd gotten a reserved section in the back. Daniel was there. He bought me a drink, then another. At 1 a.m., I told the friends I'd come with that I was going back to my hotel. I'd booked a room at the Meridian this time, to the new hotel near the river, and Daniel appeared at my elbow like a shadow. "I'll walk you out," he said. The night was cold. February in Riverside. The kind of cold that finds the gaps in your coat and settles there like it belongs. We stood outside the bar and I fumbled for my phone to call an Uber, and he took it out of my hand and set it on a nearby ledge, the same ledge I would later realize where someone had abandoned a cigarette lighter and a crumpled napkin, and he said, "Come home with me?" "No, Catherine." I said, "No, Daniel." He kissed me then. I want to say I pulled away. I want to say I fought. I want to say that I was the kind of woman who would have stopped him, who would have shoved him back and walked to the curb and gotten into the Uber and gone back to my hotel and spent the next week pretending this had never happened. But the truth is more complicated and more ugly and more human than that. The truth is that I kissed him back for a full 10 seconds, long enough to taste the whiskey on his breath, long enough to feel his hands tighten on my waist, long enough to remember every hotel room we'd ever shared before I remembered that I had said no. And by then his hands were under my coat, and the cold air was hitting my back where my shirt had come untucked, and I was saying, "Stop," in a voice that sounded like a request and not a command. He didn't stop. What happened next is something I have spent a long time trying to describe in the language it deserves. The word times, forceful times, is the word people use when they want to soften something. The word times, overwhelming times, is the word people use when they want to blur the edges. The word I keep coming back to, late at night when I can't sleep, is times, violation times. But that feels too clean for something as murky and complicated as what actually happened, which is that I was drunk and I had said no and he had not stopped, and I had, in some defeated and animal part of myself, simply allowed it to happen because the energy required to resist him felt greater than the energy I had left. I don't know how long it lasted. Long enough that someone from the bar came out to tell us to move along. Long enough that my coat ended up on the ground and my sweater was inside out, and I had rug burns on my elbows that I didn't notice until the next morning. Long enough that when it was over, I stood on that street in the cold and shook, and he put his hand on my arm and said, "Come home with me now. You can't go back to the hotel like this." I went home with him. I want to pause here and tell you something about that decision, because I've spent years trying to understand it, and I still don't think I fully succeeded. Going home with him that night was not the same as consenting to what had just happened. It was not forgiveness. It was not even, in any meaningful sense, a choice. It was something more like surrender, the particular kind of surrender that happens when you've spent so long fighting a tide that you finally stop swimming and let it carry you where it wants. I went home with him because I didn't have the strength to do anything else, because the Uber was too far away and my coat was on the ground and I was shaking too hard to operate my phone, because on some level, the part of me that had wanted this had always wanted this. Despite everything was relieved that he'd taken the decision out of my hands. That part of me is the part I'm most ashamed of, and it's the part I talk about least, because the culture we live in has very specific ideas about what women are allowed to feel when men take what they haven't been given, and relief is not one of the approved responses. But I'm 52 years old, and I've decided that honesty is worth more than comfort. Number. Chapter 9. I called him the next morning from my hotel room, still wearing the clothes from last night, my hair uncombed, and my face still bearing the particular hollowness of someone who has not slept. "I'm blocking you," I said. My voice was shaking. I was proud of myself for saying it, even though my voice was shaking. "After what you did, I'm blocking you. Do what you need to do," he said. His voice was calm, completely calm, like he'd been expecting this call for years and had simply been waiting for me to finally make it. You can't do that to me." "I can," he said. And I did. And you know why? He paused. I could hear the sound of him breathing, steady and slow, like a man who had never once in his life doubted himself. "Because we've been circling each other for 15 years, Catherine. You and I both know this was always going to happen. I just stopped waiting for you to be ready. I was ready to never see you again. Then why did you come to the reunion?" The question hit me like a slap, not because it was unfair, but because it was completely fair, and I had no answer that wouldn't incriminate me. I blocked his number that afternoon. I deleted his contact. I went back to Cedar Falls the next day and took a long hot shower and stood under the water until it went cold and tried to scrub the feeling of his hands off my skin. I stayed in the shower until my skin turned red and prune-like and the hot water ran out. And then I stood in the cold bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror, 48 years old, eyes red, body still bearing the marks of what had happened on that street in Riverside. And I tried to find the woman I had been before Daniel Harper. I couldn't. 3 weeks later, he showed up at my office. Not inside, outside, in the parking lot, leaning against his car in the late afternoon light. He was wearing a coat and no hat, and the February wind was catching his hair. And he looked exactly like the kind of man who would show up at a woman's workplace unannounced and expect that to be acceptable. I saw him from the window of my cubicle. I watched him lean against that car, a black sedan, German, probably worth more than my annual salary, and I watched him check his watch and then look up at the building like he had all the time in the world. I didn't go down. I sat at my desk and stared at my computer screen and tried to pretend I was working. 15 minutes later, my desk phone rang. It was the reception desk. "Catherine, there's a visitor for you. A Daniel Harper? He says it's urgent." I told them I didn't know anyone by that name. I told them to have security remove him if he didn't leave. I sat at my desk and shook, and I watched from the window as he looked up at the building, saw me at the window. I was sure he saw me, even from that distance, even through the glass. And then he got into his car and drove away. The next day, he was back. Same car, same spot, same leaning. This time for 2 hours. The day after that, he came at noon and stayed until 5. On the 4th day, I unblocked his number and texted him, "Stop coming to my office." He texted back immediately, "I'll stop when you talk to me." I didn't respond. The next day, he was there again. I broke on the 5th day. I went down to the parking lot at lunch and walked to his car and stood in front of it and said, through gritted teeth, "What do you want?" He looked at me through the window for a long moment, and then he rolled it down and said, calmly, as though we were discussing the weather, "I want to take you to dinner." "I don't want to go to dinner with you." "Then I'll come back tomorrow." "Daniel, I'll come back every day until you have dinner with me. Your choice." I got in the car. For a long time after that, I told myself the unblocking was a practical decision, a strategic one. I told myself I was managing a difficult situation, not capitulating to a man who had taken something from me that I hadn't freely given. But here's what I know now. At 52, sitting in my apartment in Cedar Falls with a glass of wine I shouldn't be drinking because I have a blood pressure appointment on Monday. The unblocking was the moment I gave up on the version of myself that believed she deserved to be treated with basic respect, and the giving up felt, in some terrible way, like relief, because the person who demands respect is the person who gets disappointed, and I was so tired of being disappointed. Love quiet, forbidden midlife romance? Subscribe to Noah's Awakening for more slow burn stories. Number Part 4. The Fall. Chapter 10. The next 2 years were a slow motion collapse of everything I thought I had. I remember the specific quality of the silence that followed my mother's death. Not the immediate aftermath that was full of phone calls and funeral arrangements and casseroles brought by neighbors, but the silence that set in about 3 weeks later, when the world had moved on, and I was still standing in my mother's kitchen, trying to figure out what to do with her coffee mug, the one with the chipped handle that she'd had for 30 years. The silence was so loud it felt like a physical presence. It sat in my chest, like a stone. It woke me up at 3 in the morning and kept me company until sunrise, when I would finally fall asleep again and dream about nothing. I tried to keep busy. I went to work. I filed reports. I attended the quarterly meetings and contributed to the discussions and performed the functions of my job with the mechanical precision of a machine that had been running too long without maintenance. My colleagues commented that I was holding up well. They said I was so strong. They meant it as a compliment, and I took it as one, because the alternative, admitting that I was falling apart, that the grief was so heavy I sometimes couldn't remember how to breathe, felt like a weakness I couldn't afford. My mother died in March of 2020. Cancer, the kind that moves fast, that gives you 6 weeks from diagnosis to death, that arrives at your door like a creditor you didn't know you owed. She was 78, and she was not ready, and neither was I, and the last thing she said to me was, "Find someone." Catherine and I still don't know if she meant someone to love me, or someone for me to love, and the ambiguity of it has haunted me every day since. She had been the one stable thing in my life, not my marriage. Kevin and I had been going through the motions for years by then, sharing a house and a bed and almost nothing else. Not my career. I had peaked early and spent the last decade in the same role, reviewing the same permit applications, attending the same quarterly meetings. Not my finances. I had nothing saved, and a retirement account that had been gutted by the 2008 recession and never fully recovered. My mother had been the person who called me every Sunday, the person who asked about my week and actually listened to the answer, the person who, when I told her I was fine, would say, "I know you're not, but I'll be here when you're ready to talk about it." She was gone. And for the first time in my life, I was truly alone. Chapter 11. 3 months after the funeral, my brother-in-law's restaurant went under. The investment, I'd poured my savings into $40,000, nearly everything I had evaporated in a cascade of failed health inspections, and a lease dispute, and a partner who turned out to have been cooking the books for 2 years. I lost the money. I lost the relationship with my sister, who blamed me for not seeing it coming, as though a sister should be able to spot fraud in the numbers of a business she wasn't running, as though I should have known that the man she'd married was a con artist. To add insult to injury, my sister stopped speaking to me. Not dramatically, no confrontation, no shouting match, just a slow, cold withdrawal. She stopped returning my calls. She stopped inviting me to family events. She removed me from the family group text without explanation. It was the kind of silent punishment that is somehow worse than any direct confrontation, because it leaves you with nothing to push back against, no argument to win or lose. I was 48 years old, and I had just lost my mother, my savings, and my only sibling in the span of 4 months. And then Kevin, my ex-husband, the man I'd built a life with for 11 years before he dismantled it for a dental hygienist named Brenda, who worked at a practice on the east side of town. Kevin called me in October to tell me he'd been laid off. Not out of any particular malice. He just wanted to talk. And I, in one of those moments of weakness that define the difference between healing and self-destruction, told him about my mother's death, about the money, about all of it, the full inventory of my failures, laid out like evidence in a trial where I was both the defendant and the judge. "I should have been there," he said. "You were the last person I needed," I said, and hung up. Chapter 12. I flew to Riverside on a Thursday in November. I bought the ticket that morning, and I didn't tell Daniel I was coming. I just showed up. I texted him from the arrivals terminal at Riverside International. I'm here. I was not the same woman who'd walked into that hotel room in October of 2019. I was not even close. The woman who'd walked into that hotel room had still had her mother, still had her savings, still had a husband, even if it was a failing one, still had the faint, fragile hope that things might somehow get better. The woman who landed in Riverside that November had lost all of it. She was 48 years old, and she had nothing. She was the kind of empty that is not just an emotion, but a physical state. A hollowness in the chest that makes it hard to breathe. A weight in the limbs that makes it hard to move. He met me at a hotel near the airport. Not the Harlow this time, the Meridian, the newer place near the river. All glass and stone and the kind of minimalist design that costs money. He was waiting in the lobby when he saw me unshowered from the flight, still wearing the black dress I'd put on that morning because I'd been too numb to make a real decision about what to wear. His face did something I had never seen it do before. He looked at me with pity. It was worse than anger, worse than indifference. It was the look of a man who sees exactly how broken someone is, and is calculating whether the broken version is still worth his time. "Come on," he said, and took my hand. We didn't have sex that night. I want to be clear about that, because it's important. What happened in that hotel room, the room at the Meridian with the river visible through the window and the sound of traffic below and the particular silence of city at night, was not sex.